The gloved hand moved across the metal with the precision of a surgeon, each stroke of the cloth deliberate, each pass removing another layer of frost that had settled during the night. The rifle was old, not antique, but worn in the way tools become when they outlive their expected service life. On the stock just below the cheek rest, four letters had been carved into the wood. Brennan, below that four numbers, 2011. The etching was crude, done with a field knife, the kind of work a soldier does in the small hours when sleep refuses to come. The metal of the barrel had that particular patina that comes from years in extreme weather. Not rust, not neglect, just use. The scope sat in its mount with the stillness of something that had found its place and never moved. Uneartled 10 power. No batteries, no electronics, just glass and metal and the physics of light bending through carefully ground lenses. The turrets for windage and elevation bore the scratches of 1,000 adjustments, each one a memory of a shot taken a distance calculated, a decision made. Grace Aldrich was 47 years old. Her hands, even through the gloves, showed the memory of 2 decades in uniform. Scars across the knuckles from a training accident in 2003. A faint burn on the left thumb from a hot casing that had ricocheted wrong in Kandahar. Fingers that moved with economy because she had learned long ago that wasted motion in the cold was motion that could kill you. She worked the bolt. The sound it made was specific, a metallic slide and click that had no variance. She had fired this rifle in heat that melted boot soles and cold that froze diesel fuel solid. The bolt had never stuck, not once in 17 years. The voice came from behind her, cutting through the pre-dawn quiet of the armory. Aldrich, she didn't turn, just kept working the cloth across the scope bell, removing the condensation that had formed during the night. Captain Vincent Quarles was 52, 28 years and most of them spent in places where the official record said American forces were not operating. He had the look of a man who had stopped trying to fix things and settled for managing them. His uniform was regulation, his boots polished. His face carried the particular fatigue that comes not from lack of sleep, but from an accumulation of decisions that never got easier. "You saw the memo," he said. Grace set the cloth down, picked up the bolt, inspected the firing pin. The spring tension was exact. She had replaced it herself 6 months ago with a part she had ordered from a supplier in Montana who still carried components for weapons the Army had officially retired. "I saw it." Quarles moved to the bench, looked at the rifle, then at the 3X M2010 enhanced sniper rifles lined up in their cases on the opposite wall. Factory fresh, still wrapped in the protective plastic, each one worth more than Grace made in 4 months. "Standard equipment protocol," Quarles said. "Whole unit goes with the same platform. Makes supply simple. Makes training simple. Makes sense." Grace nodded, kept working. The M40A3 on the bench in front of her was a relic by modern standards. Remington 700 action. Macmillan, a 4-stock. Unearthed scope from an era when digital meant a watch with numbers instead of hands. Weight 11.6 pounds unloaded. Effective range 800 meters if you knew what you were doing. Maximum range 1,000 if you were willing to bet your life on Kentucky windage and the ballistic tables you kept in your head. The XM 2010 on the wall featured a Schmidt and Bender scope with a ballistic computer that calculated range, wind drift, air density, and Coriolis effect faster than a human could work a bolt. Thermal imaging, digital rangefinder, quick change barrel system, advanced suppressor, weight 15.9 pounds, effective range 1,200 meters with the computer doing half the work. The new platform, Quarles continued, has capabilities your weapon doesn't. Night vision integration, suppressor effectiveness that actually works, ballistic computers tested down to -20 Fahrenheit. Grace looked up, met his eyes. "Tested where I'm," Quarles paused. "Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. That's where the facility is. Maryland doesn't get to -38. The spec sheet says, I don't trust spec sheets, sir. I trust what ISVs put 500 rounds through an actual cold. This rifle has been to -50 in the Yukon, -42 in Norway. Worked every time." Quarles sat on the edge of the bench. Outside, through the armory windows, the Alaska dawn was beginning to stain the sky a weak gray. Fort Wainwright sat in a valley where the temperature in winter could drop low enough that exposed skin froze in under a minute. Where batteries died if you didn't keep them against your body. Where lubricant turned to paste and metal contracted enough that tolerances designed in climate-controlled factories stopped mattering. "The XM2010 is the future," Quarles said. "The M40A3 is proven. Proven 15 years ago. 17, and it hasn't changed. That's the point." Quarles studied her. Grace Aldrich had 23 years in uniform, most of it as a designated marksman. 6 deployments, Iraq twice, Afghanistan 3 times. One classified operation in a country whose name still appeared on official documents as redacted black bars. Her service record listed 83 confirmed kills in combat. The actual number was higher, but the circumstances of some of those shots were not the kind that made it into files that congressional oversight committees reviewed. She had been offered promotion to sergeant major twice, declined both times, said she preferred to stay operational. What she meant was she preferred to be the one pulling the trigger instead of the one deciding who got sent to pull it. This is not a request, Quarles said, but his tone lacked conviction. Grace picked up the rifle, seated it against her shoulder. The stock fit the hollow of her collarbone the way a handshake fits between old friends. She had worn the wood smooth in the exact places her cheek and hands touched. The balance point sat just forward of the magazine well. She could hold it steady for 3 minutes without the tremor that comes from muscle fatigue. You need a designated marksman on this mission, Grace said. You need someone who can make shots at range in conditions where everyone else is fighting their equipment just to see the target. You want me to bet my life and the lives of this team on a weapon I've never fired in actual cold. That's not protocol, sir. That's gambling. Quarles was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sound of diesel engines turning over. The cough and rumble of vehicles being prepped for the mission. Somewhere in the pre-dawn dark, 13 other soldiers were checking gear, drinking bad coffee, trying to squeeze out a few more minutes of warmth before stepping into cold that would spend the next 72 hours trying to kill them. This mission only, Quarles finally said. After this, we revisit the conversation. Understood. And if that rifle fails, it won't. Quarles stood, looked at the rifle one more time, the carved name, the year. The worn finish that spoke of use measured not in months but in years and continents, and weather that did not care about manufacturer warranties. Brennan, he read aloud. Cole Brennan, Afghanistan 2011. I read the after-action report. Grace said nothing. He was your spotter. He was. The report said shrapnel, said he survived the initial contact but the wound didn't heal right. Said he died 3 months later on a separate operation because his body was too weak from the first injury. Grace set the rifle down, began loading rounds into the magazine. Federal gold medal match, 168 grain. Hollow point boat tail, each round hand-selected from a batch she had personally tested for consistency. The brass cases gleamed dull in the armory light. She had 5 magazines, each held 5 rounds. 25 rounds total. It was all she would carry. The report also said, Quarles continued, that you blamed yourself, that your shot had missed because you miscalculated the wind, that the target you missed was the one who threw the grenade that wounded Brennan. Grace pressed the first round into the magazine. The spring resistance was firm and even. I don't blame myself, sir. I know what happened. Wind shifted 4 seconds before I fired. I didn't wait for it to settle. I took the shot anyway. Brennan paid for my impatience. And the rifle did exactly what it was designed to do. I'm the one who failed. She loaded the second round, then the third. The magazine held 5. She loaded all 5 and then cycled 1 into the chamber. 4 in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 5 total. Then she cleared the chamber and unloaded the magazine and started again. Muscle memory, ritual. The kind of thing you do before a mission, not because you need the practice, but because the repetition settles something in your chest that words can't reach. Brennan gave you the rifle, Quarles said, before he died. Told me it wasn't the rifle's fault I missed. Told me to learn from it. Have you? Grace looked up. Her eyes were the color of slate. No warmth in them, no coldness either. Just the flat assessment of someone who had learned to see the world as a series of problems requiring solutions, not emotions requiring expression. I haven't missed since. She finished loading all 5 magazines, secured them in her vest, 25 rounds. It would have to be enough. The briefing room was small, concrete walls, folding chairs, a projection screen showing a satellite image of terrain that looked like God had taken a crumpled piece of paper and dropped it from a great height. Mountains, valleys, rivers frozen into white ribbons, and in the center of it all, a small red X. Quarles stood at the front. Behind him, the image shifted. Now it showed a UH-60 Blackhawk. Then a close-up of the crash site. Rotor blades sheared off, fuselage crumpled, snow already beginning to cover the wreckage like a shroud. 72 hours ago, Quarles began. A medevac helicopter went down in the Alaska Range, approximately 120 miles north-northwest of here. Crew of 3, pilot, co-pilot, crew chief. Last transmission indicated mechanical failure. No mayday, no coordinates, just a sudden loss of contact. The image shifted again. 3 faces. Military ID photos with that particular quality of forced composure that comes from sitting in front of a camera and being told to look professional while holding completely still. Chief Warrant Officer Blake Sutherland, pilot, 16 years service, 2 combat deployments. Chief Warrant Officer Grant Weatherly, co-pilot, 12 years, 1 deployment. Staff Sergeant Paige Donnelly, crew chief, 8 years, Afghanistan veteran. The faces disappeared. The satellite image returned. Satellite imagery located the crash site 48 hours ago. Weather prevented immediate response. A storm system moved through and sat on top of the area for 36 hours. That storm cleared 12 hours ago. We now have a window. Forecast says we have 72 hours before the next system arrives. That next system is projected to be worse. After it hits, the area will be inaccessible for at least a week, possibly longer. Quarles pressed a button. The image zoomed in. The terrain became clearer. Ridgelines, valleys, a narrow corridor between 2 peaks. This is our route, 15 miles in. Temperature at the crash site is currently minus 34 Fahrenheit. Wind chill drops that to minus 52. We go in light. We go in fast. We locate the crew. We extract. Questions. Staff Sergeant Wade Hollis raised his hand. 38 years old, barrel-chested and blunt. The kind of NCO who spoke in statements disguised as questions. Survival odds after 72 hours in that cold. Low, Quarles said. Not zero. The helicopter had survival gear. If they were uninjured and smart, they could have created shelter, could have stayed alive. But we're not going in expecting to find them walking around. So this is recovery, not rescue. We proceed as rescue until evidence indicates otherwise. Hollis nodded, sat back. His expression said he had already written the mission report in his head, and it ended with body bags. Corporal Lyle Garrett raised his hand. 24 years old, son. Knew enough that his gear still had that factory stiffness, old enough that he had stopped asking stupid questions. Rules of engagement, sir. Standard. We are not expecting hostile contact, but this is remote territory. Hunters, trappers, people who don't appreciate military presence. If we encounter civilians, we identify ourselves and request they clear the area. If they refuse, we note their location and continue mission. We do not engage unless engaged first. And if engaged, then we respond proportionally and continue mission. Our priority is the crash site. Everything else is secondary. Grace sat in the back, said nothing. Watched the satellite image. Her eyes traced the route Quarles had marked, noted the elevation changes. The narrow passages where the terrain would funnel them into single file. The places where an ambush would be simple, where retreat would be impossible, where the only option would be to push forward or die trying. She had been on missions like this before. Officially, unofficially, in places where the landscape itself was the enemy and human threats were just an additional complication, layered on top of cold and altitude and distances that turned minor injuries into death sentences. The briefing continued. Logistics, loadout, communication protocols, medical contingencies, all the planning that sounds thorough in a heated room but falls apart the moment the temperature drops and the wind starts erasing footprints faster than you can make them. Grace tuned it out. She had heard it before. Different terrain, different mission, same essential truth. Plans were useful right up until contact. After that, it was training and luck, and the particular kind of stubbornness that kept you moving when your body screamed to stop. The meeting broke. Soldiers filed out. Grace remained seated, stared at the satellite image, at the red X marking the crash site, at the white emptiness surrounding it. Quarles approached. Something on your mind, Aldrich. Grace pointed at the screen, at a spot 3 miles south of the crash site. This valley. What's the tree line? Quarles checked his notes. Approximately 1,800 feet. Why, man? Because if I were going to watch that crash site, that's where I'd do it from. High ground, clear sight lines, close enough to mark on the wreckage, far enough to avoid being seen. You think someone's watching it? I think a helicopter crashes in the middle of nowhere and sits there for 72 hours, someone's going to notice. Hunters, trappers, maybe just curious locals. And if they see military moving in, they might decide to clear out. Or they might decide to see what we're after. Quarles frowned. This is Alaska, not Afghanistan. Cold doesn't change human nature, sir. Just changes how long you can afford to be stupid about it. They left Fort Wainwright at 0400 hours. 14 soldiers and 2 vehicles. The sky was still dark. The temperature was -28. The forecast said it would drop another 10 degrees by noon. Grace sat in the back of the second vehicle, her rifle case secured between her knees. Around her, soldiers checked gear with the mechanical efficiency of people who had done this enough times that thought was no longer required. Web gear adjusted, magazine pouches positioned, knives secured in places where they could be accessed with either hand. Specialist Nora Cassidy sat across from her. 42 years old, senior medic, 15 years in, face like a hatchet, and hands that could start an IV line in a moving vehicle on a patient whose veins had collapsed from dehydration. She caught Grace looking and nodded once. Grace nodded back, no words needed. They had deployed together twice. Had shared a bunker in Kandahar when mortar fire had turned a routine night into 6 hours of hoping the next round landed somewhere else. The vehicle stopped 12 miles north of the fort. This was as far as roads went. Everything after this was on foot. They unloaded in silence. Packs shouldered, weapons checked. The transition from vehicle to foot movement had its own rhythm, a shedding of anything that wasn't essential. A tightening of straps and a final adjustment of loads until weight distributed evenly and nothing shifted with movement. Quarles gathered them. Column formation, 5-meter spacing. Hollis on point, I'm second. Scouts in rotating positions. Aldrich, you have rear security. Cassidy, Drummond, stay center with the medical gear. We move in 30-minute increments. Every 30 minutes we stop. We check for cold injuries. We hydrate. We ensure no one's gear is failing. Questions? None. Move out. They stepped into the forest. The snow was deep, not the light powder that blows and shifts, but the heavy accumulated pack of months of winter. Each step required lifting the foot clear and placing it deliberately. Snowshoes helped, but only to a point. The real work was in the legs and the lungs and the particular kind of endurance that comes from knowing the only way forward is one step at a time for as many steps as it takes. The forest closed around them. Black spruce and white spruce. Lodgepole pine. Bare birch. The trees stood in irregular ranks, their lower branches heavy with snow, their trunks dark against the white. Wind moved through them in slow waves. No sound of birds. No sound of animals. Just the creak of branches and the soft whisper of snow sliding from heights and landing in muffled impacts below. Grace moved at the rear, eyes scanning, not looking for anything specific, looking for deviation, for the pattern that didn't fit, for movement that had purpose instead of randomness. Her breath came in measured cycles, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The scarf across her face trapped some of the warmth, but not all. The cold bit at her cheeks, at the exposed skin around her eyes, at her fingertips despite the gloves. She carried the M40A3 across her chest, muzzle down, safety on, magazine loaded, chamber empty, ready to become ready in the time it took to cycle the bolt. They walked for 30 minutes, stopped, checked, continued. The pattern repeated. The landscape changed slowly, gradual descent into a valley. The trees thinned, the wind picked up, the temperature dropped. At the 2-hour mark, Hollis raised his fist. The column stopped. Grace moved forward, found Hollis kneeling in the snow, looking at something on the ground. "What is it?" Hollis pointed. Boot prints, old but still visible, a line of them crossing their path at an angle, leading northeast, away from their route. Grace knelt, studied the prints. The tread pattern was distinct. Vibram sole, hiking boot, not military issue. The spacing between steps indicated someone moving with purpose, not running, not hurrying, just covering ground efficiently. She looked at the depth of the print, at the way snow had partially filled it, at the edges where wind had softened the definition. 48 hours, she said. Maybe a little less. Hunter, Hollis asked. Or trapper, hard to say. Could be someone who heard about the crash. Could be coincidence. Hollis stood, looked northeast. The prints disappeared into the tree line. We note it and continue. Unless you want to follow them off mission. No. They moved on, but Grace filed it away, stored it, because in her experience, coincidences in wilderness were rare, and people who left boot prints in snow 2 days before a military rescue operation were usually people worth remembering. They reached the first campsite at 1600 hours, a rock face that broke the wind, a small clearing where snow had drifted, but not deep enough to prevent movement. They formed a defensive perimeter out of habit more than threat assessment. Packs came off. Hollis and Quarles set up a watch rotation. Cassidy and Specialist Kirk Drummond established a medical checkpoint and began checking extremities for early signs of frostbite. The scouts cleared snow and began the process of coaxing frozen wood into fire. It took 20 minutes to get the fire going. The wood was wet. The air was cold enough that heat dissipated faster than it could build. But eventually flames caught and held. Small, weak, but enough to gather around. Grace set her rifle case down on a tarp, opened it, removed the M40A3. The metal was cold enough to burn bare skin. She kept her gloves on, began the evening maintenance routine. Cloth across the barrel. Check the crown for ice. Inspect the scope mounts for shifting. Work the bolt to ensure no moisture had found its way into the action. Verify the trigger pull. Check the sling attachments. She did this every night, had done it for 17 years. The ritual was as much about confirming the weapon's function as it was about confirming her own readiness. Garrett approached the fire, saw Grace working, moved a step over the tarp. His boot caught the rifle case. Not hard, just a nudge, but enough. Grace's head came up. Garrett froze. Sorry, Sergeant. Didn't see it. Grace said nothing, returned to her work. But Garrett, young and nervous and needing to fill silence with something, kept talking. That rifle, is it true it's been around since, like, the 90s? Hollis, warming his hands at the fire, glanced over. Longer than that, Garrett. That's an M40A3. They stopped making those in 2009. So it's old. Ancient, Hollis said. The word carried weight. Not quite mockery, not quite respect. Just statement. Tyler Locke, one of the scouts, looked up from where he was arranging wood. Does it even work anymore? Jordan Pike laughed. Short, tired. The kind of laugh that comes from a long day and the need for something, anything, to cut the tension. Probably jams every other round. Museum piece, Hollis added. He said it casually, matter of fact, not trying to wound, just stating what seemed obvious. Brennan died 13 years ago. Rifle should have retired with him. Grace kept working. Her hands moved with mechanical precision. Cloth across the scope bell. Cloth across the objective lens. Check the turrets. Check the parallax. Garrett, emboldened by the others, grinned. What happens if the digital scopes fail? You're going to use like a compass and prayer. More laughter, soft, scattered among the group, not cruel. Just soldiers finding humor in the small things because the big things were too heavy to joke about. Grace set the cloth down, picked up the rifle, inspected the bolt face in the firelight. The metal gleamed. No carbon buildup, no wear. Just the smooth surface of a mechanism that had been maintained with religious consistency. She said nothing. Quarles, sitting apart from the fire, watched but didn't intervene. This was team dynamics, stress relief, a necessary venting before the real work began. He would step in if it turned mean. But this was just tired soldiers poking at an easy target. Grace finished her inspection, wrapped the rifle in its case, set it down with the same care she had shown throughout. Then she pulled a small notebook from her pocket, flipped it open. Inside were dope cards, range tables, wind calculations written in her own hand. Data collected over 17 years and 6 deployments and distances, measured in meters and lives measured in heartbeats between decision and execution. She reviewed the cards, updated one with a pencil, noted the temperature, the altitude, the barometric pressure she had checked before they left. Hollis watched her. You really think that old gun is going to outperform the XM2010 Oz? Grace looked up, met his eyes. Her expression hadn't changed, hadn't hardened, hadn't softened. Bolt is frozen. I'll still be able to put rounds on target. That's not opinion. That's fact. She closed the notebook, slid it back into her pocket. Hollis held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. Not agreement, not disagreement. Just acknowledgement in that she had stated her position and he had no immediate counter-argument worth voicing. The fire crackled. Someone added more wood. The conversation shifted to other things. Rations, watch rotation, the probability of the downed crew still being alive. Grace moved away from the fire, found a spot at the edge of the perimeter where the light didn't reach, sat with her back against a tree, rifle across her lap, eyes adjusting to darkness. Cole Brennan entered her mind the way he always did on missions. Not as grief, not as longing, just as the accumulated weight of lessons learned. Brennan had been 40 when he died, should have been off the line, should have been training new spotters back at Benning or Bragg. But he had stayed operational because that's what you did if you were good enough and stubborn enough and convinced that the job mattered more than the years. He had taught her to read wind by watching snow blow off ridgelines, taught her to calculate cold air density by feel rather than formula, taught her that equipment failed and luck ran out, but training, if it was good enough, could carry you through the moments when everything else fell apart. The day he gave her the rifle, he was already dying. Didn't know it yet. The shrapnel wound in his side had been treated, had been declared healed, but infection had set in deep. The kind that doesn't show symptoms until it's spread too far to stop. He had handed her the M40A3 and said, "This rifle didn't miss. You did. Learn the difference." She had learned. In the years since she had fired that rifle in rain that turned to ice on the barrel, in wind that pushed bullets 6 inches at 400 meters, in dust storms that filled every crevice with grit, in cold that made her fingers so numb she couldn't feel the trigger until she pulled it. The rifle had never been the problem. Across the camp, the fire burned low. Soldiers settled into sleeping bags. Watch rotation began. The forest pressed in from all sides, dark and cold and waiting. Grace stayed awake, listened to the wind, to the small sounds that the night made when humans stopped moving. The creak of ice, the whisper of snow falling from branches, the soft crack of wood contracting in the cold. And beneath it all, something else. A pattern that didn't fit. She waited, listened harder. There, a branch snapping. Too clean, too sharp. Not the sound of snow weighing down a limb until it broke, but the sound of weight applied suddenly, deliberately. Distance 300 meters, maybe less. Direction north-northwest. Upslope. She didn't move, didn't call out, just listened. Silence returned. But it was different now. The kind of silence that comes after something has disturbed the pattern and is waiting to see if it's been noticed. Grace rose slowly, moved to where Hollis was standing watch. "Something's out there." Hollis turned, his hand moved to his rifle instinctively. Where, northwest, 300 meters, heard a branch snap, too deliberate to be natural. Hollis scanned the darkness, saw nothing. The trees were black shapes against slightly less black sky. No movement, no light. Could be an animal. Could be. But you don't think so? No, Hollis considered, then shook his head. Wind and paranoia Aldrich. We're all hearing things after a day like this. Grace didn't argue, just returned to her position. But she didn't sit, stayed standing, kept watching the tree line. Because she had heard things before. In places where the cost of ignoring the small sounds had been measured in casualties, in failed missions, and reports that began with, "If we had known," she had learned to trust the small deviations, the patterns that didn't fit, the silence that felt wrong. An hour passed. Nothing moved. No sounds repeated. But Grace didn't relax. Because the thing about threats in wilderness wasn't that they announced themselves. It was that they waited, watched, calculated, and struck when you had convinced yourself you were safe. At 0200 hours, the watch changed. Garrett took over from Hollis. Grace finally sat, but she kept the rifle across her lap, kept her eyes on the darkness. Sleep could wait. The forest had spoken, quietly, briefly, but it had spoken. And Grace Aldrich had been doing this long enough to know the forest never lied. The next sound came at 0347 hours, not a branch this time. A crack, sharp and flat, the unmistakable report of a rifle fired from distance. Then Hollis screaming. Then the night erupted. The bullet hit Hollis in the thigh, high, just below the hip joint. The impact spun him sideways and dropped him into the snowbank he had been standing beside. He went down hard, no cry, just a grunt of expelled air and the wet sound of bone meeting frozen ground. Grace was moving before the sound of the shot finished echoing off the rocks. Her hands found the rifle, pulled it from the case, bolt back, round chambered, safety off. The sequence took 2 seconds. Muscle memory older than thought. 25 rounds. That was all she had. She would need to make everyone count. The camp exploded into motion, soldiers rolling out of sleeping bags, hands scrambling for weapons. Voices calling out in the controlled chaos of contact drills executed in darkness. A second shot punched through the spare radio pack hanging from a tree branch. The radio died in a burst of sparks and shattered plastic. Their backup communication. Their link to extraction. Gone. Quarles was shouting orders, positions, fields of fire. Get the wounded to cover. Capressa suppressed the threat. Standard contact drill. Voice steady despite the situation because that's what leadership was. Projecting calm when everything had gone to hell. Grace didn't wait for orders. She was already moving to high ground. A small rise 30 meters from the camp. Barely a bump in the terrain, but enough to give her angles the others wouldn't have from the flat. She dropped prone. ignored the cold that bit through her jacket, set the rifle on her pack, began scanning through the scope. The scope was clear. No fog, no condensation. Just the crisp, magnified darkness of a winter forest at 0347 hours. Movement, northeast, between two black spruce trunks, a shadow detaching from other shadows. Grace tracked it, led it, waited for the pattern to repeat. There, a figure, moving with purpose. Weapon raised, professional stance. She calculated. 620 meters, slight uphill, wind from the west at maybe 8 miles per hour, temperature -36, air dense. Bullet drop would be less than standard tables. She adjusted, half a mil up, quarter mil left for wind, controlled her breathing, let the sight picture settle, waited for the space between heartbeats. Fired. The M40A3 bucked against her shoulder. The sound was a dull thump, suppressed slightly by the cold air and absorbed by the snow and trees. Through the scope, she saw the figure drop. No confirmation, no time to verify. She was already working the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round, scanning for the next threat. 24 rounds remaining. Below her, the camp was returning fire. The sharp crack of M4 carbines, the longer bark of the XM 2010 Maoz muzzle flashes lit the darkness in brief orange blooms. But something was wrong. Jordan Pike was slapping his scope, cursing. The thermal imaging had fogged. Condensation from his breath hitting the cold lens. The digital display was a useless blur. Tyler Locke's rangefinder was dead, the screen blank. Battery killed by the cold. Devin Thatcher had switched to iron sights, was firing blind into the tree line, suppressing fire, hoping volume would make up for accuracy. Grace saw it all in peripheral glances, saw the equipment failing, saw the soldiers adapting, saw the mission degrading from controlled response to desperate reaction. She kept shooting. Target 2, 700 meters, behind a fallen log. She saw the muzzle flash, tracked back, waited for movement. There, she fired. Bolt, reload, scan, 23 rounds, target 3, 550 meters. Moving between trees, she led the target, calculated the intercept point, fired. The figure stumbled, went down, didn't get back up. 22 rounds. Grace's breathing was steady. Her hands were cold but functional. The rifle was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. No electronics to fail, no batteries to die. Just steel and wood and the physics of ballistics that had worked the same way for a century. She heard Quarles shouting, directing fire, pulling the unit into a tighter defensive position, getting the wounded to cover. Cassidy was working on Hollis, cutting away fabric, packing the wound. Her hands were steady despite the incoming rounds that were kicking up snow around the medical tarp. Grace fired again. Target 4, a shooter trying to flank from the north. 600 meters, clean hit. 21 rounds. Below, Quarles was making the call. We cannot hold this position. Prepare to displace. Wounded to center. Cassidy, can Hollis move? Negative, femoral artery intact, but he's lost blood. Moving him risks shock. We move him anyway. Pike Locke, you have litter duty. Thatcher, Mercer, cover the northeast. Aldrich, keep them off us. Grace acknowledged with 2 clicks on her radio. Didn't waste breath on words. She scanned, found another target, fired, missed. The target had moved just as she squeezed the trigger. Wind shift she hadn't accounted for. 20 rounds. She cursed silently. Adjusted. Fired again. This time the target dropped. 19 rounds. The incoming fire was slowing. The attackers were reassessing. They had expected to overrun the camp in the first minutes of contact, had expected surprise and darkness to do most of the work. But Grace's counterfire had disrupted their rhythm, made them cautious. Below, the unit was moving. Hollis strapped to a hasty litter made from a sleeping bag and 2 ski poles. Cassidy and Drummond on either side, the rest forming a loose perimeter as they pulled back into thicker timber. Grace stayed on the rise, covering, scanning. She saw them then, through the scope. 3 figures moving together. Coordinated, professional. One of them was directing the others with hand signals. She focused on that one, studied the movement pattern, the gear, the way he held his weapon. U.S. Military equipment, old but well-maintained. Load-bearing vest in woodland camouflage. Weapon looked like an M4 variant. But the stance, the movements, those were trained, drilled, the kind of muscle memory that came from years doing this work. The figure turned, just slightly, enough for Grace to see the side of his face in the dim pre-dawn light. Her breath caught. She knew that face. Marcus Ashford, 58 years old, former JSOC Delta operator for 12 years, instructor at Fort Benning for 6. Grace had been one of his students in 2001, had learned long-range reconnaissance from him. Patrolling, evasion and escape, the fundamentals that kept you alive when everything went wrong. He had been declared K1A in 2019. Black operation. Classified location. The official story was an ambush in Africa. Nobody recovered. Family told he died serving his country. But here he was, in Alaska, leading an attack on a military rescue operation. Ashford raised a megaphone. His voice carried across the snow. Grace Aldrich, I know that's you. Recognize you're shooting. Quarles BLO signaled for radio silence. No response. Ashford continued. 17 years. Same rifle, same habits. Cole Brennan taught you well. Grace said nothing. Kept her crosshairs on his chest. 680 meters. Slight wind. She could make the shot. But killing your former instructor required certainty she didn't have. Not yet. You're outgunned, Ashford called. Outmanned. And you've got wounded. Smart move is to leave the helicopter. Leave this valley. I'll let you walk out. No pursuit. You have my word. Quarles keyed his radio. Private channel to Grace. Your call, Aldrich. You know him? Yes, sir. Marcus Ashford was my instructor, reported KYA 5 years ago. Can we trust his word? Once yes, now unknown. A pause, then Quarles. Mission is the crew. We didn't come this far to leave empty. Grace clicked twice. Agreement. She shifted her aim, not at Ashford, at the radio operator standing 3 meters to his left. Fired. 18 rounds remaining. The radio operator dropped. The tactical radio on his back shattered. Ashford dove for cover. The megaphone fell into the snow. Grace was already moving, rolling left, crawling down the backside of the rise. The return fire came fast, rounds impacting where she had been, snow and frozen dirt kicking up in small eruptions. She reached the tree line, stood, ran in a crouch to where the unit was forming up. Quarles grabbed her shoulder. That was a statement. Yes, sir. What's it going to cost us? He won't let us walk now, but he also won't rush us. He'll follow. Wait for us to make mistakes. How many? I counted 12, maybe more. All trained, all equipped. Quarles processed this, looked at Hollis on the litter, at the terrain ahead, at the sky that was just beginning to show the first gray hint of dawn. We move for the crash site, stay ahead of them, find the crew, call for extraction from there. Sir, the radio. I know, but the crash site might have a working radio, or the crew might have survival gear we can use. Either way, we're not getting out of this valley without transport, and we're not getting transport without communication. He was right. Grace knew it. Staying in place meant fighting a defensive action they couldn't win. Moving meant staying ahead of pursuit while carrying wounded and searching for a crash site that might contain nothing but bodies. The choice was between bad and worse. They moved. The terrain turned difficult. The corridor between ridges narrowed. The snow deepened. Each step required full commitment. Lift, place, transfer weight, repeat. The litter carriers switched every 10 minutes. Pike and Locke, then Thatcher and Finn Mercer, then Drummond and Garrett. The weight of a 180-pound man, plus gear, plus the litter itself. Distributed across 2 people. Carried through snow that grabbed at every footfall. Hollis was conscious but fading. His face had the grayish tint of blood loss. Cassidy had the bleeding controlled, but she couldn't replace what he'd already lost. She kept checking his pulse, kept talking to him, keeping him present, because unconsciousness in this cold was a slide towards something you didn't come back from. They reached a ravine, steep sides, frozen creek at the bottom, the way forward. Quarles studied it. The slope was 30 degrees, maybe 35 in places, manageable for unloaded soldiers. Dangerous with a litter. We rope it, he decided, then Locke find an anchor point. Pike rigged the belay. Everyone else prepared to assist the litter on descent. They worked fast. Time was a resource they were spending faster than they could afford. Every minute stopped was a minute. Ashford's team closed distance. Grace took up position at the ravine edge, covering their back trail, scanning for pursuit. She saw nothing. But absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. Ashford was too smart to skyline his people. He'd be using terrain, staying in the trees, parallel tracking. The rope work took 8 minutes. Then they started down. The litter went first, Quarles and Garrett managing the ropes from above, Pike and Thatcher guiding from below. Hollis strapped in tight. The descent was controlled chaos. The litter swinging, the snow giving way under boots, hands gripping rope through gloves that were already frozen stiff. Halfway down, the rope slipped. Not much, 6 inches, but enough to send the litter swinging hard to the left. Hollis grunted. The motion had stressed his wound. Fresh blood appeared on the bandage. Cassidy cursed, scrambled down alongside, got her hands on the litter, stabilized it. They reached the bottom, reset, continued. The ravine floor was narrow, 10 feet wide. The frozen creek was a ribbon of white ice down the center. The walls rose on both sides, cutting the wind, trapping sound. Grace didn't like it. Didn't like the way it funneled them. Didn't like the limited sight lines. Didn't like the fact that anyone on the rim above would have perfect firing positions. She said as much to Quarles. Noted, he replied, but it's the only route to the crash site coordinates. We go through or we go back. They went through. The ravine stretched for half a mile. The walls gradually lowered. The space opened. They emerged into a wider valley, and there, 300 meters ahead, was the helicopter. The UH-60 sat crumpled in a clearing. The rotor blades were sheared off, scattered around the impact site like broken arms. The fuselage had buckled on the left side. The tail boom was bent at an angle physics said shouldn't be possible. Snow had drifted against the wreckage, partially covering it, making it blend with the landscape until you were close enough to see the dark metal beneath the white. Quarles raised his fist. The unit stopped. Aldrich Thatcher established overwatch. Everyone else prepare to move on the site. Weapons ready. Could be survivors, could be hostiles, could be nothing. We clear it by the numbers. Grace moved to a low ridge on the left, found a position behind a fallen log, set her rifle, scanned the crash site through the scope. No movement, no smoke, no signs of life. The unit advanced in 2 teams, Quarles leading one. Hollis would have led the second, but he was on the litter. Mercer took his place. They reached the wreckage, cleared the exterior. Quarles disappeared into the cabin, emerged 30 seconds later. Keyed his radio. 3 souls, 2 alive, 1 deceased. Get Cassidy up here now. Cassidy and Drummond moved fast, carrying the medical gear, the trauma kits, the warming blankets, everything they had that might keep a cold, stressed patient alive long enough to reach actual medical care. Grace watched through her scope, watched them pull the first survivor from the wreckage. Chief Warrant Officer Blake Sutherland, the pilot. He was moving, barely. The hypothermia had him. His movements were sluggish, uncoordinated, the kind of motor control failure that meant core temperature had dropped into dangerous territory. They wrapped him, applied heat packs, got fluids into him. The second survivor was Staff Sergeant Paige Donnelly, the crew chief. She was worse. Compound fracture of the left leg. The bone had broken through the skin. Cassidy was working the wound, cleaning it, stabilizing it. The risk of infection in these conditions was high. The risk of shock was higher. The deceased was Chief Warrant Officer Grant Weatherly, the co-pilot. He had died on impact, blunt force trauma. Nothing that could have been prevented with better gear or faster response. Just the physics of a helicopter falling from the sky and the human body's inability to withstand forces measured in G-loads and sudden stops. Grace continued scanning. Then something caught her eye, the tail rotor housing. Bullet holes, not impact damage. Bullet holes. She keyed her radio. Captain, check the tail rotor housing. Port side. Quarles moved to examine it. His posture changed. He understood immediately. The helicopter hadn't gone down from mechanical failure. It had been shot down. This wasn't a rescue mission stumbling into hostiles. This was an ambush. Ashford's team had shot down the helicopter, had waited for military response, had planned this. Quarles pulled his team back, gathered them. Situation update. This aircraft was shot down deliberately. This is a planned ambush. We have 2 critically injured from the crash. One needs evac within 12 hours, or we lose him to hypothermia complications. One needs surgery within 24 hours, or she loses the leg. Our radios are destroyed. The helicopter's radio is non-functional. We are 48 hours from the nearest road, 72 hours from extraction if we walk. And we have trained hostiles in pursuit who planned this entire scenario. He paused. Let that sink in. Options. We can dig in here, defend, hope someone notices we missed check-in and sends a search party. Or we can push for the extraction point, try to get to high ground where we can signal aircraft. Silence. Then Hollis from the litter, his voice weak but clear. We don't negotiate with people who ambush us. And we don't leave crew behind. We push for extraction. Quarles looked at Grace. Aldrich, Grace was studying the terrain, the ridgeline to the east, the valley floor, the approach vectors Ashford would use. If we stay here, we die. If we try to move with 3 litter casualties, we move too slow and they catch us. But if some of us stay and delay them while the rest move the wounded, we might buy enough time. You volunteering? Yes, sir. How many do you need? Grace did the math in her head. Fields of fire, ammunition, how long she could hold a position before being flanked. One more. Someone who can shoot. Someone who won't panic when it gets bad. Locke raised his hand. I'll stay. Grace looked at him. 29 years old. Scout. Good instincts. Had kept his head during the earlier contact despite his equipment failing. Can you shoot iron sights at distance? Yes. Proved it yet? No. You're about to. Quarles made the decision. Aldrich and Locke hold this position. Everyone else moves the casualties to the extraction point. Rally point is the Ridges line 5 clicks east. High ground. Good visibility. If we can get there, we can signal for help. Questions? None. Aldrich, how long can you hold? Grace looked at her watch, looked at the ammunition she had left. 18 rounds in the M40A3, 15 in her M9 Beretta. 2 spare magazines for the pistol. 2 hours. Maybe 3 if they're cautious. After that, we displace and catch up. And if you can't catch up, then we don't. Mission is the wounded. You get them out. That's the priority. Quarles held her gaze. Nodded once. They prepared to move. Cassidy had Donnelly stabilized, the legs splinted, the wound packed. She was conscious but in shock. Her eyes had that distant look of someone whose body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature. Sutherland was better. The warming blankets and hot fluids had brought some color back to his face. He could walk with assistance. Slowly. But he could move. Hollis was the question mark. Still bleeding internally, Cassidy thought. Maybe. The signs were there but subtle. If she was right, he had hours. If she was wrong, he had days. Either way, he needed a hospital. They loaded the casualties, 3 litters now, rotating carriers. They able-bodied taking turns because no one could carry that weight for long in this cold. The unit prepared to move. Grace and Locke stayed behind. They chose their position carefully. A small rise overlooking the crash site. 2 approaches from the west, good sight lines. A fallback route to the east. Grace set up behind a snow-covered log. Locke took position 3 meters to her right. Different angle. Different field of fire. If one of them went down, the other could still cover the position. They waited. The unit disappeared into the trees. The sound of their movement faded. The forest went quiet again. Locke checked his rifle. M4 carbine. Iron sights. He had taped the failed digital scope to the side. Dead weight, but he hadn't wanted to leave it behind. Something about abandoning issued equipment bothered him even when that equipment had failed. You ever done this before? He asked. Grace didn't look at him. Kept scanning through her scope. Which part? The holding action. 2 against many. Yes. How'd it go? I'm here. And the people you were holding with. Grace was quiet for a moment. Some of them are here too. Some aren't. Locke absorbed that, checked his magazines, verified his count. He had 120 rounds. 5 magazines, plus 1 in the weapon. Grace had 18 rifle rounds, 45 pistol rounds, against an unknown number of attackers with unknown ammunition reserves. The math wasn't good, but math had never been the deciding factor in situations like this. Training was. Discipline was. The willingness to do the job even when the work was impossible. They waited. 30 minutes passed. Then movement. Grace saw them first. 4 figures. Moving through the trees west of the crash site. Spread out. Tactical spacing, weapons ready. She ranged them. 520 meters. Within her effective range. She could take the shot. Drop at least 1. Maybe 2 before they found cover. But she didn't. Not yet. Because once she fired, they would know the unit had left a rear guard. They would know they couldn't just walk up and claim the crash site. And they would adjust tactics accordingly. Better to wait. Let them commit. Then hit them hard enough to make them cautious. The 4 figures reached the crash site, began clearing it, moving through the wreckage, looking for supplies, for weapons, for anything useful. One of them keyed a radio. Grace couldn't hear the transmission, but she could see the posture change. The way they relaxed slightly, the way they began moving less tactically and more casually. They thought the area was clear. Grace centered her crosshairs on the radio operator. Locke, she said quietly, when I shoot you, engage targets on the left. I'll take right. Controlled pairs. Make your shots count. Copy, she breathed, waited for her heartbeat to settle. Fired. 17 rounds remaining. The radio operator went down. Locke opened up. 3-round burst. The figure on the left spun and dropped. The remaining two dove for cover. Returned fire, but they were shooting blind. Didn't have Grace in Locke's position yet. Grace worked the bolt, acquired the third target. He was behind the helicopter's tail boom, only his head and shoulders visible. She aimed for center mass of what she could see. Fired. 16 rounds. Miss. The round sparked off metal. She cursed. Adjusted. Fired again. 15 rounds. This time the target dropped. The fourth figure was running, breaking west, trying to reach the tree line. Locke fired. Missed. Fired again. The figure stumbled, but kept moving. Grace tracked. Led. Fired. 14 rounds. The figure went down hard. Didn't move. 4 targets. 4 down. Grace had used 4 rounds. Locke had used maybe 20. Grace scanned for more threats, saw none. But Ashford wouldn't have sent only 4. This was a probe. A test. Now he knew the area wasn't clear. Knew someone had stayed behind. Locke, how much did you use? 22 rounds. 98 left. Make them count. Next time they come, they'll come different. They didn't have to wait long. 15 minutes later, the second assault came. This time from 2 directions. 4 from the north, 3 from the south. Coordinated, using suppressing fire, advancing by teams. Grace and Locke split targets. Grace took north. The targets were using cover better now. Moving faster, she was getting glimpses. Partial targets, difficult shots. She fired. Worked the bolt. Fired again. 13 rounds, 12, 11. She hit 2 confirmed, maybe a third. Hard to tell in the chaos. Locke was firing faster, shorter bursts. The iron sights limited his effective range, but he was doing damage, keeping the southern approach suppressed. Then Grace heard it, a sound she knew, the flat crack of a precision rifle. Not an M4, something heavier, longer range. A round impacted the log she was behind, buried itself in frozen wood 6 inches from her face. Sniper. She rolled left, changed position, scanned for the shooter. There, 800 meters, on a ridge to the northwest, prone, barely visible. She calculated. Wind, distance, the cold air, the uphill angle. Adjusted her scope. Fired. 10 rounds remaining. Through the magnification, she saw snow kick up next to the sniper's position. Close, but not close enough. The sniper adjusted. Fired back. The round hit her pack. Tore through the top flap. Missed her by 8 inches. She rolled again. Found new cover, a small depression in the ground, barely enough to hide her profile. She was breathing hard now. The adrenaline was spiking, the cold forgotten in the focus required to stay alive. She centered the crosshairs, waited for the sniper to shift position. Everyone shifted eventually. It was human nature. Stay in one place too long, and you started to feel exposed. There, a slight movement, repositioning the rifle. Grace fired, 9 rounds. This time she saw the scope through her scope, saw it jerk, saw the sniper's head snap back. Clean hit. The assault was breaking up, the attackers pulling back. They had learned what they needed to know, learned that the position was defended, learned it would cost them to take it. Locke was reloading, down to his last magazine. 60 rounds left. Grace checked her watch. They had held for 90 minutes. "We need to move," she said. "They'll follow." "Yes, but we've bought time. The wounded are 3 clicks ahead by now, maybe more." They prepared to displace, gathered their gear, made sure nothing was left behind that would tell Ashford more than he already knew. Grace took one last look at the crash site, at the wreckage, at the bodies lying in the snow. Mission priorities were clear. The living came first. The dead could wait. They moved east, following the unit's trail. Moving fast but not running. Running in deep snow was a good way to exhaust yourself and collapse. Behind them, Ashford's team would be regrouping, planning the pursuit. They would come. It was just a question of when and how hard. Grace and Locke covered 2 clicks in 40 minutes. Pushed themselves. The cold was eating at them now, the exertion making them sweat despite the temperature. And sweat in this cold was death deferred. Not prevented, just delayed. They caught up to the unit at a narrow passage between 2 rock faces. Quarles saw them coming. Relief showed briefly on his face before professionalism covered it. Report. Delayed them 90 minutes, confirmed at least 7 KIA on their side. They'll pursue, but they're being cautious now. Ammunition status. 9 rounds rifle, 60 rounds carbine for Locke. Quarles processed this. 9 rounds against an enemy force of unknown size. In terrain that favored defense, with 3 critically wounded who needed constant care. The math kept getting worse. They continued moving. The extraction point was still 3 clicks ahead. High ground, where they might be able to signal for help, if they could reach it, if Ashford didn't catch them first, if the wounded survived the journey. Too many ifs. But Grace had learned long ago that missions were built on ifs, on variables you couldn't control, on luck that ran out eventually. What you could control was training, discipline, the willingness to keep moving when stopping meant dying. They moved. The terrain climbed, the snow deepened. Every step was effort measured in burning muscles and labored breathing. Hollis lost consciousness. Cassidy couldn't wake him. His pulse was weak, rapid, the signs of shock advancing towards system failure. Donnelly was delirious, talking to people who weren't there, her core temperature dropping despite the warming blankets. Sutherland was holding on but fading. The hypothermia had damaged more than they could see. Metabolic processes shutting down, organs working harder to do less. They were losing the race against time and cold and distance. Grace knew it, Quarles knew it, but neither said it out loud because saying it would make it real in a way that silence didn't. They reached the base of the final ridge at 1100 hours. The slope was steep, 40 degrees, maybe 45 in places, covered in ice where wind had scoured the snow away. It was climbable, barely. With 3 litters, it was nearly impossible. But nearly impossible was still possible. Quarles made the call. "We climb. Aldrich, I need you to hold here again. Give us time to get the wounded up." Grace looked at the slope, at the time it would take, at the ammunition she had left. 9 rounds. She nodded. Understood. This time she was alone. Locke went with the unit. He had more ammunition, more utility carrying litters than staying back. Grace found her position, a cluster of rocks at the base of the slope. Good cover. Clear fields of fire down the approach route. The unit began climbing, slow, agonizing. Every meter gained through effort that left people gasping and fingers numb and hope dwindling. Grace waited. She could see them coming now. Ashford's team, moving through the valley below. 9 of them, maybe 10. They weren't rushing. They knew the terrain, knew the unit was trapped against the ridge. Grace ranged the leader. 640 meters. She centered her crosshairs. This was it. The last stand, 9 rounds against 9 attackers. Math that didn't work. Odds that couldn't be beaten. But Cole Brennan had taught her something 17 years ago. You don't beat the odds. You make them irrelevant. She slowed her breathing, waited for the wind to settle, and prepared to fire the last 9 rounds in the M40A3. The first round took the point man at 640 meters. Grace saw him through the scope, watched him move with the confidence of someone who believed the difficult part had passed. He scanned the ridge ahead without checking the rocks at its base. The mistake cost him. The .308 federal gold medal match hit center mass. He dropped without understanding why his chest had stopped working. Grace worked the bolt before his body settled into the snow. Brass ejected in a smooth arc. New round chambered. The mechanical rhythm as familiar as breathing. 8 rounds remaining. She tracked left, found the next target at 580 meters. A figure moving between 2 black spruce. She led the movement. Calculated intercept. Fired. The figure collapsed. 7 rounds. Above her on the slope the unit was climbing. She heard boots scraping ice, ragged breathing, muted curses when someone slipped. They had covered maybe a third of the distance. 2/3 remained. 20 minutes minimum. Probably more with 3 litters. She didn't have 20 minutes. But she would give them what she could. Movement left. A flanker using the rocks. 400 meters. Closing fast. Grace fired. The round hit, but the target stumbled without falling. Body armor had caught it. 6 rounds. She cycled the bolt, aimed higher, center of visible mass, fired. 5 rounds. This time the figure went down and stayed there. The mathematics were becoming clear. 9 attackers, 5 rounds remaining. Even perfect shooting couldn't stop them all. But stopping them wasn't the mission. Delay was. Every minute she held this position bought the unit meters on that slope, bought the wounded time they desperately needed. She shifted position, moved 3 meters right, found new cover behind a different rock formation. The previous position was compromised. Anyone with training would already be ranging it. Suppressing fire arrived 15 seconds later, automatic burst chewing into the rock where she had been, stone fragments and ice crystals spraying outward in small violent clouds. Grace waited, let them waste ammunition on empty ground. When the firing paused for reload, she rose, acquired a target at 520 meters, kneeling behind a log, coordinating the others with hand signals. She centered her crosshairs on the coordinator's chest. Fired. 4 rounds. The signaling stopped. Her shoulder was beginning to protest the rifle's recoil. The cold was working deeper into her joints, making each movement slightly slower, slightly stiffer. She cataloged the pain and set it aside. Pain was just information. It could be processed later if there was a later. Marcus Ashford's voice carried across the distance. Grace, she continued scanning, didn't respond. Words were wasted breath and wasted time. You're down to what 3 rounds for? We both know you can't stop all of us. Grace checked the slope. He was right. The unit had stalled halfway up. One of the litters had shifted. They were trying to stabilize it without dropping the casualty down the ice face. Look at your people, Ashford continued. They're exhausted, carrying wounded, barely moving. They won't make it up before we reach them. Grace knew he was speaking truth, could see it in the way the litter carriers were moving, in the frequent stops. In the desperate, slow progress against terrain and gravity, and the accumulated weight of mission failure pressing down on already spent bodies. Leave the helicopter crew, Ashford said. Take your soldiers, walk away. 2 hours head start, my word on it. His word. Grace considered what that meant. What it had meant when he wore the uniform, when he taught at Benning, when honor and mission and oath were things that carried weight. But that man had died somewhere in the 5 years between being declared K1A and reappearing in an Alaska valley leading attacks on military personnel. She gave him her answer without words, shifted her aim to the radio operator standing 3 meters to his left. Fired. 3 rounds. The operator dropped. The tactical radio on his back shattered. Ashford's voice came back harder. Stupid Grace, you just made this personal. She watched him through the scope, watched him signal his remaining people, watched them prepare for the final push. No more talking, no more offers, just the violent mathematics of trained men closing distance against a lone defender with 3 bullets. They came from 3 directions, coordinated movement, suppressing fire, not surgical anymore, just overwhelming volume and speed. Grace targeted the closest threat, a figure at 400 meters, fired. 2 rounds, he dropped. She worked the bolt. 2 rounds in the chamber and magazine. The remaining attackers kept coming. 350 meters, 300, closing faster than she could reload and acquire and fire. She fired again. Hit. The target went down. 1 round left. She worked the bolt. Last round in the chamber. Magazine empty. The remaining attackers kept coming. 250 meters, 200. Closing the distance. Decision point. She grabbed her M9 Beretta, 15 rounds in the magazine, 1 chambered. Effective range 50 meters against a thinking target. Maximum effective range against body armor even less. But it was what she had. The first attacker reached 150 meters. Grace fired 3 rounds. Saw impacts on his chest. Saw him stagger but not fall. The 9mm rounds couldn't penetrate his vest at this distance. Physics and ballistics were against her. She shifted to better cover. Waited for him to close. 100 meters. She fired again. Controlled pairs. Center mass, let him walk into the rounds. He dropped. The second kept coming. 75 meters now. Grace's mind processed the situation in the flat analytical way that replaced panic when training was deep enough. The unit needed 5 more minutes on that slope. She couldn't give them 5. But 3 was possible. 3 was doable. She fired. The attacker dove behind a rock outcrop. Pinned but not eliminated. Movement from her right. Another flanker. She swung the pistol. Fired twice. 1 miss, 1 hit. The figure went down. Her slide locked back. Empty magazine. She dropped it, pulled a fresh magazine from her belt, reloaded. Muscle memory executing the action faster than conscious thought could direct. 13 rounds in the pistol. 1 rifle round still in the M40A3. Against at least 3 mobile attackers who were now less than 70 meters out. The attacker behind the outcrop broke cover. Sprinting. Trying to close before she could engage. Grace fired. Hit. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Fired again. Another hit. This time he went down hard. Sound behind her. She spun. Too slow. The cold had stolen fractions of seconds from her reaction time. A figure 20 meters out. Rifle coming up. Grace dove left. Felt the supersonic crack of rounds passing through the space her head had occupied. Rolled. Came up on 1 knee. Fired. Click. Not empty. Misfire. The round hadn't seated properly in the chamber. She dropped the pistol. Grabbed the M40A3. 1 round in the chamber. No time to work the bolt if this failed. The attacker was closing. 10 meters. 5. Grace brought the rifle up. No time for the scope. Just pointed it like her life depended on the muscle memory of knowing where the barrel was aimed by nothing but feel and instinct. Fired. The .308 round hit at 5 meters. The impact was catastrophic at point-blank range. The attacker went down and stopped moving. Grace worked the bolt. Ejecting the spent brass, the chamber was empty. No more rifle ammunition. She retrieved her pistol, cleared the malfunction, chambered a fresh round from the magazine that had been in the weapon. 12 rounds left. Scanned for more threats. Found Marcus Ashford, standing alone at 300 meters. His remaining people were down, dead or wounded or scattered. The assault had broken. He had his rifle. Could have taken the shot. Should have. She was exposed, standing. An easy target for someone with his training. But he didn't fire. Just stood there across the killing ground, looking at her the way one professional looks at another when the outcome is decided and both sides know it. Then he raised his hand, not a wave, not a salute, just acknowledgement. The gesture said, "You won this one." He turned, walked into the trees, disappeared. Grace wanted to shoot, wanted to end him for Hollis, for Cassidy, for every casualty this mission had cost. But training overrode emotion. Don't shoot retreating enemy unless they're regrouping. Ashford was done. Shooting him in the back would accomplish nothing except wasting ammunition she might still need. She turned to the slope, started climbing. Her legs felt like water. The adrenaline was crashing. The cold was settling back into her awareness with crushing weight. She had held the position. The unit had made it up. But the cost was still being calculated in her body's demand for resources it no longer had. She climbed. Every meter was effort measured in burning muscles and oxygen debt. Her hands found holds in ice and rock. Her boots scraped for purchase on surfaces designed by geology to shed anything trying to ascend them. The rifle across her back felt like it weighed twice what it had that morning. Halfway up, her right hand slipped. She caught herself with the left. Pain spiked through her shoulder. The old injury from 2012. The dislocation that had never healed quite right. She could feel something grinding that shouldn't grind. She ignored it, kept climbing. Near the top, hands reached down, grabbed her pack, pulled her up the final meters. Tyler Locke. His face was pale with exhaustion, but he was grinning. "You held them." Grace just nodded. Couldn't spare breath for words. Captain Quarles approached. "Status. Out of rifle ammunition. 12 rounds pistol. Ashford's team is down to him and maybe one or two others. They withdrew." "Our casualties." Grace looked around the ridge top. Counted. Chief Warrant Officer Blake Sutherland sat against a rock. Warming blankets wrapped around him. Conscious but weak. The hypothermia had him, but he was fighting it. Staff Sergeant Paige Donnelly lay on a litter. Specialist Nora Cassidy working on her with the focused intensity of someone who knew she was losing, but refused to accept it. The leg wound was worse. Infection advancing despite the cold. Or because of it. Staff Sergeant Wade Hollis lay on another litter. Not moving. Face gray. Grace walked over, looked down at him. Cassidy glanced up, her face tight. Internal bleeding. Lost consciousness 20 minutes ago. Pulse is weak, but he's still here. Needs surgery within the hour or we lose him. Not dead, not yet, but close enough that the difference was measured in minutes. Grace absorbed this. Hollis had mocked her rifle, had dismissed her warnings, had been an asshole more often than not. But he was a soldier, had done his job, was still doing it by continuing to breathe when his body wanted to quit. That counted for something. She turned to Cassidy. The medic's hands were steady, but her eyes showed the strain. 2 critical patients, limited supplies, no hospital within reach. The kind of situation where training could only do so much and the rest was luck and time and resources you didn't have. "You're doing everything right," Grace said. Cassidy nodded without looking convinced. Returned to working on Donnelly's wound. Grace moved to where Quarles stood with binoculars, scanning the valley below for pursuit that hadn't materialized. "We need extraction. Radio's dead." "I know, but we're on high ground. Clear line of sight. If any aircraft comes within 50 miles, we might be able to signal them." "Might. It's what we have." They set up the signal, cleared a space in the snow, laid out an orange panel in the shape of an X. The international distress signal, visible from air if anyone was looking, useless if they weren't. Then they waited. The temperature continued dropping. The wind picked up. The forecast storm was arriving ahead of schedule. They built what shelter the terrain allowed. Snow walls, tarps stretched between rocks, body heat shared by soldiers who sat close and tried not to calculate how long they could survive up here without resupply. Cassidy checked Donnelly again. The crew chief's pulse was rapid, thready. The infection spreading faster than antibiotics they didn't have could stop. Without surgery, she had hours, maybe less. Sutherland was holding steady, not improving, but not deteriorating. The hypothermia hadn't progressed, but it hadn't reversed either. He needed controlled rewarming. IV fluids, hospital care, things that existed somewhere far from this ridge. Hollis remained unconscious. Cassidy had done what she could, packed the wound, managed the bleeding, but internal injuries required surgery, and they were out of time and options. Grace sat apart from the others, rifle across her lap, empty chamber, empty magazine. A tool that had done its job and now sat waiting for rounds it would never fire again. Cole Brennan entered her thoughts, not his memory, but his presence. The last time she had seen him alive. Walter Reed Medical Center, 2011. He had looked small in the hospital bed, diminished. The shrapnel wound in his side had been declared healed, but infection had set in deep where doctors couldn't see it. He had given her the rifle that day, told her it wasn't the rifle's fault she had missed, told her to learn the difference between equipment failure and operator error. She had learned, had carried that lesson through 17 years and 6 deployments, had maintained the weapon with religious consistency, had trusted it when equipment with better specifications had failed around her. It had never let her down, had worked when digital scopes fogged and batteries died and mechanisms froze, had given her the accuracy she needed exactly when she needed it. Now it was empty, had fired its last round at point-blank range against an attacker who had come too close for the scope to matter. The weapon had done everything asked of it. She had done everything asked of her, and 2 people were still dying. She heard the rotors before anyone else. Her head came up, eyes scanning the sky. There, south, low and fast, a UH-60 Blackhawk. Different crew but same model as the one that had crashed and started this whole nightmare. Quarles was already moving, pulling out a signal mirror, reflecting weak sunlight toward the aircraft. The helicopter continued past without slowing, hadn't seen them. Grace stood, pulled a flare from her pack. The last one. She had been saving it, hoping not to need it. She fired it into the sky. The flare arced up, trailing red smoke and brilliant light. The helicopter banked hard, came around. They had been seen. The aircraft circled once while the pilot assessed the landing zone. The wind, the terrain, the margins for error that didn't exist at this altitude in these conditions. Then it began descending. Rotor wash created instant whiteout, snow lifting and blinding curtains. Grace turned her back, protected her eyes, felt the downdraft trying to push her off the ridge. The helicopter touched down. The crew chief jumped out, began coordinating loading. Donnelly went first, critical. Strapped to a litter, Cassidy climbed in beside her, continuing treatment even as the aircraft prepared to lift. Sutherland next, walking with assistance, wrapped in blankets, still hypothermic but stable enough to sit. Hollis, unconscious, breathing shallow. The crew chief handled him with the efficiency of someone who had loaded dying men before. The rest of the unit began boarding, moving fast. The pilot wanted to be airborne before the weather closed in completely. Grace was last. She climbed into the cabin, found a seat against the bulkhead, the rifle case between her knees, empty weapon inside, tool that had served faithfully and was now finished. The crew chief did final checks, signaled the pilot. The helicopter lifted. The valley fell away beneath them. The crash site visible as a dark scar against white. The ridge they had climbed just a line of rock. The forest where Ashford had disappeared, just endless trees stretching to horizons. Inside the cabin, soldiers slumped in their seats, exhausted, processing what had happened in the only way soldiers knew how, by going quiet and internal and waiting for the shock to settle into something they could carry. Cassidy was working on Donnelly, 4 running, vitals being monitored, doing everything possible with limited equipment in a vibrating aircraft at 3,000 feet. Grace watched her work, saw the focus, the dedication, the refusal to quit, even when the outcome looked inevitable. Then Cassidy's hands slowed. She checked for a pulse, checked again. Her shoulders sagged. She looked up, met Grace's eyes across the cabin, shook her head. Donnelly was gone. The infection had spread too fast, had shut down her system somewhere over the Alaska range while the helicopter raced toward medical care that arrived minutes too late. Cassidy sat back. Her lips moved silently. Maybe prayer. Maybe just the mental process of accepting that she had lost a patient despite doing everything right. Grace looked at Hollis, still unconscious, still breathing. Cassidy must have seen the question because she leaned over, checked his vitals, looked back at Grace and gave a small nod. He was alive. Barely, but alive. The flight to Fort Wainwright took 37 minutes. Medical personnel were waiting on the tarmac. They took Hollis immediately, rushed him to surgery, started treatment for internal bleeding and shock. They took Sutherland to intensive care, began controlled rewarming protocols. Donnelly's body was taken to the morgue, tagged, prepared for transport home. The unit was debriefed, checked for injuries, treated for minor frostbite and exhaustion. Released. Grace went to her quarters, sat on her bunk, looked at the rifle case. She should clean the weapon, should maintain it properly even though it was empty, should prepare it for whatever came next. But nothing was coming next. Not for her, not for this rifle. She was done. The decision settled into her with the weight of something inevitable. Something she had known was coming, but hadn't acknowledged until this moment. 23 years was enough. She had served, had done the job, had made the shots when they mattered, and accepted the consequences when they came. It was time to stop. 2 weeks later, Grace stood in Arlington National Cemetery. The headstones stretched in perfect rows. White marble. Identical. The final formation that required no commands and never broke ranks. She found the one she was looking for. SSG Cole Brennan, 1971 to 2011. The grass around it was trimmed perfectly, maintained by people who had never known him but honored him anyway. Grace knelt, set the M40A3 against the headstone. The worn wood and cold metal looked out of place against pristine marble. Too used, too real. But it belonged here. She didn't say anything. Words felt inadequate. Cole would have understood anyway, would have known the rifle had done its job, that she had done hers, that sometimes doing your job meant accepting costs that couldn't be avoided. She stood, looked at the headstone one more time, then walked away. Her shoulder ached, the injury from climbing the ridge. The doctor said she could continue serving if she chose. Desk work, training, staff positions. She had declined. 3 months later, Grace received a phone call. Hollis had survived. Months of surgery and physical therapy. He walked with a pronounced limp now. Would for the rest of his life. But he was alive. He had taken a position with the VA, counseling coordinator in Anchorage, helping other veterans navigate the transition from service to civilian life, helping them carry weights that didn't have names or solutions. Just presence and understanding and time. Garrett had also survived. Lost the index and middle fingers on his left hand to frostbite. The doctors had tried to save them, but the tissue damage was too severe. He was still in service. 2nd Battalion, Alaska. Learning to shoot right-handed. Adapting. Continuing. Sutherland had recovered fully. Returned to flight status. Was flying medevac missions over the same territory where he had nearly died. Donnelly was buried in her hometown, Illinois. Small ceremony. Family and friends and soldiers who understood what she had given. Cassidy had returned to duty. Still working as senior medic. Carrying the weight of losing Donnelly, but refusing to let it stop her from doing the job. Grace stood in her apartment in Montana and processed this information. The survivors, the dead, the costs distributed across bodies and minds, and the rest of lives that would carry scars visible and otherwise. A knock at the door. She answered. Found Corporal Lyle Garrett in dress uniform, his left hand conspicuously missing 2 fingers. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for what you did. Grace looked at his hand, at the clean stumps where fingers had been. You paid for that, thanks. Small price. I'm alive. Hollis is alive. 10 of us made it because you held that position. Donnelly didn't make it. No, ma'am, but that wasn't on you. That was the mission, the terrain, the situation. You did everything possible. Grace studied him, saw youth that had been aged by experience, saw certainty that hadn't existed before the mission. I'm going to sniper school, Garrett said. Wanted to ask about the rifle, why you chose it. Grace was quiet for a moment. It wasn't the rifle. It was knowing my equipment completely, trusting it because I had tested it. The rifle was simple. No electronics, nothing that could freeze or fail. But that simplicity only mattered because I maintained it perfectly. Could you teach me? No, I'm done teaching. But I'll tell you what Cole Brennan told me. Don't trust anything you haven't tested. Don't bet your life on specifications. And remember that equipment fails. The only constant is training. Garrett nodded, thanked her, left. Grace closed the door, returned to the window overlooking Montana mountains that stretched without end. The rifle was at Arlington, with Cole, where it belonged. Not in a museum, not on display, just resting. She had carried it as far as she could, had used it well, had proven that reliability and simplicity could outperform sophistication when conditions were extreme enough. But that lesson had cost Donnelly her life, had cost Hollis his mobility, had cost Garrett his fingers, had cost all of them something that couldn't be calculated in after-action reports. The snow began falling outside, light at first, then heavier. Grace watched it accumulate, watched it cover the landscape in white that would last until spring. She had done her part, had served honorably, had made the shots when they mattered. The rifle had done the same, and now both of them could rest. The Smithsonian had requested the M48-3 for their military history collection. Grace had declined. The rifle stayed at Arlington, where soldiers rested, not where tourists looked, but the museum had sent a researcher anyway, wanted to document its history for their records. Grace had agreed to one mom interview. She told them the facts, the specifications, the service record, the missions. She didn't tell them about the weight of carrying it for 17 years, about the ritual of maintenance that became meditation, about the particular sound the bolt made when worked with cold hands in colder weather, about trusting a piece of metal and wood more than she trusted most people. Those things weren't facts, they were truths, and truths didn't belong in museums. The researcher left satisfied. Grace returned to her life. Montana. Mountains. Silence. The snow fell. The seasons changed. Time continued its patient work of covering everything that had mattered. Grace Aldrich stood at her window and accepted it. The consequences. The weight that never quite lifted but became familiar enough to carry. She had held the line, had made the shots, had brought people home. Not all of them, but some. And in the mathematics of war, some was the best anyone could hope for. SFC. Grace Aldrich. Retired 2024, age 47, 23 years service. Medical discharge, shoulder injury. PTSD. Current status, civilian in Montana. M40A3. Serial number 784521. Service 2007 to 2024. Decommissioned 2024. Current location, Arlington National Cemetery. Resting against headstone of SSG Cole. Brennan, SG Cole Brennan, A, Afghanistan, 2011. Age 20 years service. Buried Arlington National Cemetery. SSG Wade Hollis, WI. Alaska, 2024, age 38. Medical retirement, 2024. Permanent disability, mobility impairment. Left leg current FUV, a counseling coordinator. Anchorage, CP. Alal Garrett, WI. Alaska, 2024, age 24, frostbite injuries, lost index and middle fingers left hand, current status, active duty, 2nd Battalion, Alaska, CW3. Blake Sutherland, rescued Alaska, 2024, age 41, full recovery from severe hypothermia, current status, active duty, medevac pilot, SG Page, Donnelly Kaye, Alaska, 2024, age 34, died in flight from septic shock, secondary to compound fracture infection. Buried, Illinois. Hometown Cemetery. SPC Nor. Laura Cassidy, survived Alaska mission, 2024, age 42, 15 years service, current status, active duty, senior medic, Fort Wayne Route, mission status, success, objective, locate and recover, crashed helicopter crew, result 1 crew member recovered alive, 1 time, IA team casualties, 1 occasion IA2. IA duration, 72 hours, conditions minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, extreme terrain, hostile contact. Equipment, assessment, standard issue. XM2010, rifles 4 units deployed. 4 units failed due to extreme cold legacy. M40A3. Rifle 1 unit deployed 0 failures. Recommendation, designated marksman retain equipment, selection authority for extreme environment operations. Classified addendum, hostile force identified as former U.S. military personnel, declared KYAO 2019. Leader, former JSOC operator, Marcus Ashford. Status remains at large. Threat level, ongoing action classified.